Questions have been raised about how terror suspects are monitored in New Zealand after a man stabbed and wounded at least 6 people at a supermarket in Auckland. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern described it as a terrorist attack inspired by Islamic State group ideology. The attacker, who was Sri Lankan, was being watched by police and intelligence agencies. Our correspondent Phil Mercer reports.
The attacker was under 24-hour surveillance when he began his rampage at a supermarket in Auckland. It lasted less than a minute, but 6 people were wounded, some of them seriously.
He stabbed this woman when she came out. I was going in. I went down to the other end. There was an old gentleman, European man, lying on the ground.
Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, said the assailant was shot dead by the police within 60 seconds of the attack starting.
What happened today was despicable. It was hateful. It was wrong. It was carried out by an individual, not a faith, not a culture, not an ethnicity, but an individual person who was gripped by ideology that is not supported here.
Senior officers have insisted that armed police intervened as quickly as they could.
The reality is that when you are surveilling someone on a 24/7 basis, it is not possible to be immediately next to them at all times. The staff intervened as quickly as they could, and they prevented further injury in what was a terrifying situation.
The man, a Sri Lankan national, arrived in New Zealand a decade ago, was identified as a national security threat in 2016 and had been monitored ever since. Despite his dangerous views, there was no legal reason for him to be detained.
We have utilised every legal and surveillance power available to us to try and keep people safe from this individual. Many agencies and people were involved.
This act of violence will stir painful memories in New Zealand of the deadly mosque attacks in Christchurch in March 2019, when a gunman, a self-confessed white supremacist, murdered 51 worshippers. Once again, the nation's isolation has been no defence against extremism. Phil Mercer, BBC News, Sydney.
Alexander Gillespie is a professor of international law and conflict specialising in terrorism at Waikato University. He says New Zealand's alert level of Islamic State-inspired attacks has dropped off in recent years.
It was seen as a concern more around 2014, 2015. But as the Islamic State lost its power and influence, they weren't concerned as much. It was always there. But increasingly what happened was when we had the Christchurch attack, the focus switched. And so the security services were not looking so much at religious extremism, but now 50% white extremism and 50% religious extremism. It was there, but it would seem to be declining.
Was that an error by them, do you think? Because obviously people will be concerned that somebody who's supposed to be on a watch list has been able to inflict an attack like this.
I don't think it's an error. I think it's a reassessment of the threat situation that we had. I think before what happened in Christchurch, we were in a somewhat utopian situation, which was not correct. And since then, we've now had 2 terror attacks. And it should be noted as well that Auckland right now is in lockdown, a high-level lockdown with COVID-19. And so the attack was in one of the few places where people could congregate, which was the supermarket.
And the background of the attacker, what more do we know about him? Because he is Sri Lankan, we know certainly.
That's what's been released. And we know he's been on a watch list for quite a while. The concern that most people will have, though, is that although he was on a watch list, he wasn't actually apprehended. And the reason for this was that he had not triggered any law that would have allowed for his incarceration.
How concerned do you think people there should be about any further attacks now?
There's always a risk of copycats, and there's also a risk of reprisals against the Muslim community. The terror level itself hasn't changed, but what you're seeing is not just a community which has got quite strong solidarity, but a legislative process going through government. Like the government was already trying to deal with this gap that may have contributed to this current situation. New Zealand's terror laws, its firearms laws, its laws around hate speech, everything changed after Christchurch, and they were in the process of changing these laws when this current attack happened.
Alexander Gillespie there.